Yes, Champaka, I think we can go ahead.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, we are at CPR and CSH. We are delighted to invite Carol Upadhyay to the 196th CPR CSH Urban Workshop Series. As you all know, this is a long-running workshop series which began in 2010. It was planned both by the CSH, New Delhi, and the Center for Policy Research, which seeks to provoke public discussion on issues relating to the development of cities and tries to address all its facets, including administration, culture, economy, society, planning, and politics. Our talks generally engage with either or both empirical and theoretical questions. Today, Carol Upadhyay is going to present and share with us her work on Amaravati and India's urban future, where she analyzes the diverse roles of capital, political formations, and the state at different scales, regional, national, and transnational, in the making, unraveling, and revival of the Amaravati project, which spans over a period of 10 years. Carol Upadhyay is a social anthropologist, is honorary visiting professor at National Institute of Urban Studies in Bangalore in India, where she heads the Urban and Mobility Studies program. Her latest publication is an ethnography of the imagination and development of Amaravati, a greenfield city project in Andhra Pradesh titled Urbanizing the Future, a New City Project in Agrarian South India, published by Berghan Books in 2026. She is co-editor of a collaborative volume on Bangalore's transformations, chronicles of a global city, speculative lives, and unsettled futures in Bengaluru with Vinay Gidwani and Michael Goldman. And I've had the privilege also to engage in some discussions with Carol and other colleagues who have co-authored and been part of this other book as well. Upadhyay is also the author of Re-Engineering India, Work, Capital, and Class in an Offshore Economy. She's published in journals such as Third World Quarterly, Environment and Planning A, Economy and Space, Urbanization, Economy and Society, Contemporary South Asia, and Economic and Political Weekly, and co-edits the Journal of South Asian Development. Carol, we're really delighted to have you here with us, and over to you, please, for sharing more about your book.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to start, but I'll just first share my screen. Now?
Visible now. Yes.
Okay, great. Good. Okay, so I'll just hop right into it. Again, thanks so much to Champaka and the whole CPR CSH team for inviting me. The plan is to talk about this book that has recently been published. And this book, as Champaka said, actually is based on more than 10 years of field research. I became interested in the Amaravati project because, I mean, I haven't actually had an interest in the Andhra region for a very long time, but I was also doing field work in the region when state bifurcation happened. And as you all know, the idea of or the plan for a new capital city was first mooted in 2014 after the Telugu Desam party led by Chandrababu Naidu came back to power. And so I happened to be in the area when all this was taking place and when the plans for the project were being announced. So I kind of took it on as a personal project that I pursued over the years. It was planned as a long-term project precisely because a project of this type obviously is going to take a long time to unfold. So my plan was to go back to the region a few times a year just to see what was happening and collect my field data that way. And my interest was first piqued when, as I said, I was doing fieldwork on another project at the time. And I had gone to the house of a prominent politician who lives in Guntur town just after the land pooling scheme for this project had been announced. And when I went there, there happened to be a group of farmers from some of the affected villages who had come to take his advice. And so they invited me to go back to Rayapuri, which is one of the villages in the new capital zone, in the evening with them, where they had planned meetings with other farmers to discuss the land pooling scheme, which, as you can imagine, was something very new, unheard of, and nobody really understood what it was all about. So there I met all these local farmers. All of them had copies of the map that outlined the area that the government planned to acquire for the new city. And everyone was very angry. They wanted to know why so much land was going to be taken by the government. They were asking, why do we need so much land to build a new capital? And is this a democratic way of doing things? So there was a lot of discussion and back and forth, of course, at that time. But what really struck me was that within a few months, these same landowners and farmers had become avid supporters of the project. They were praising the chief minister's vision for the new city. They agreed to participate in the land pooling scheme. And they began to look at the project as a boon for them because they became convinced that they would have a lot of financial gains from the project. The speed and ease with which farmers and other landholders were separated from their land, in this case, is practically unprecedented in contemporary India, where, as you all know, most mega projects of this type often meet with widespread protest around land acquisition. So this was one of the first questions that I pursued through my research. I was interested in how can we explain this rapid shift in sentiment from resistance to participation? Why did small cultivators as well as large landowners agree to participate in this land pooling scheme? And so on. A second key question that drove my research was about the imagination of the city itself and the urban future and the model of development that it represents. And these are images, of course, from the master plan. On its face, the idea of building a brand new city in an already populated rural area seems overly ambitious, indeed impossible, given all the obstacles that similar projects have faced in India, not to mention the huge financial and social costs. So my question was, how did the government, how did the people, and Naidu in particular, come to believe that this project is feasible and desirable? So on my field visits, I was talking not only to farmers, but also to government officials, planning consultants, local politicians, etc., to understand how this idea of Amaravati began to take hold amongst the public, which it did actually quite widely. And then the second part of it was, of course, to see how the plan was materializing on the ground. And of course, it's not that everyone was supporting the project. There were critical voices as well. And in the book, I also follow these contestations around the project. The larger issue here really is that, and the reason why I wanted to write the book is because I believe that the story of Amaravati, which is still unfolding and will take decades probably to become an actual living city, illustrates the fault lines in India's current development trajectory, and especially the policy thrust on infrastructure development and urbanization as keys to growth. The story also raises questions about the entanglements of urban planning with speculative land and real estate markets, and about policy models that hinge on the assetization of land. So before I get into details, I want to just mention one caveat. As Champaka said, I am a social anthropologist or sociologist. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an urban policy person. And so there's a lot of technical aspects of this project that I'm not probably well acquainted with. But my interest is really in how urban development is conceived and executed, and what happens to it on the ground as projects like this unfold, as ordinary people begin to engage with a project like this, either in favor or in opposition. And especially what I learned from following this project is to think about how people's aspirations and interventions actually reshape this kind of top-down planning that we see in the case of Amaravati. So I'll first give a brief outline of the whole story. I'm sure many people here are familiar with it, but just in case not. As I said, soon after bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh, the TDP came back to power, led by N. Chandrababu Naidu, who came back to power after a gap of 10 years. And as you all know, when he was Chief Minister of undivided Andhra Pradesh between 1995 and 2004, he had earned a reputation as a neoliberal reformer who had transformed Hyderabad into a major hub of India's IT industry, building new areas of the city, Cyberabad, and so on. And so his ambition was to foster a similar kind of development in residual Andhra Pradesh, which in fact was left largely rural and agrarian with the loss of Hyderabad, except for Vizag, which is an industrialized center. So his ambition centered on this idea of building a greenfield city that he touted at that it would be the first fully planned city to be built in several decades. And so it would serve not only as the capital, political capital of the state, but also as its engine of economic growth. After a long debate that took place, and Partho knows about this very well, about where the new capital should be located, they chose a site in a rural area of Guntur district, just across the Krishna River from the major regional town of Vijayawada. This choice actually ignored the recommendations of the Shiva Ramakrishnan committee that had been appointed by the central government to examine this question. But there are reasons which we can perhaps go into later as to why the government settled on this particular site. And again, as you probably all know, because he had this ambition to build a world-class city, a global city in this site, Naidu requested the Singapore government for help designing the master plan. And the urban design firms Savannah and Jurong were commissioned for the project. The detailed master plan was officially notified in February 2016. The plan covers 217 square kilometers and encompasses 29 villages with a total population of about 1 lakh. And the plan, of course, there are many details in the planning documents, but the idea was to create a high-density mixed-use urban center, and of course, not simply an administrative capital, but it was envisioned to become a major center for industry and business, designed to support a population of 2.5 million by 2050. Echoing the language that we see in these kind of planning documents, really in greenfield cities across the world, the Amaravati plan has everything in it. It promises people-friendly green urban design, smart governance, sustainable transportation, walkable neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. The whole thing is laid out, of course, very well, as you can imagine, because they were beginning with what was imagined to be a blank slate. The AP Capital Region Development Authority, which is APCRDA, it's commonly called CRDA, was set up by an act of a law that was passed, and it was given absolute power to acquire, sell, transfer, and alienate land for the purpose of development within the project zone. And it was also, of course, given broad powers to plan and implement the project, bypassing existing political and administrative structures. For example, with the declaration of the new capital zone, the functioning of panchayats in the 25 revenue villages was suspended, and the CRDA took over all the planning and development functions that are normally under the purview of these elected bodies. And Champaka and I recently spoke about this. APCRDA was also given the mandate to plan and control development in a much larger designated Andhra Pradesh capital region, which is a huge area of 8,600 square kilometers, encompassing 953 villages and 12 urban local bodies in 26 mandals of Guntur district and 30 mandals in Krishna district, which is to the north across the river. The new development zone covers the major regional towns of Vijayawada and Guntur and supersedes the existing planning region, which is called VGTM, Vijayawada, Guntur, Tenali, Mangalagiri. Now, this plan or this mandate raises a whole nother set of questions about planning that I really haven't gone into myself, and a lot of jurisdictional conflicts have already arisen around this, which we can perhaps come back to later. This is just an image of the seed capital plan. The seed capital was planned right on the along the riverfront. This was Naidu's dream, is to have, of course, a city right on the river, which is a very beautiful site, and to have riverfront development. And this seed capital was to be the central business district, and as well as the main government center, where all the so-called iconic buildings and landmark towers would be built. You've all heard about the designs that were submitted or commissioned from firms like Foster and Partners. A consortium of Singaporean companies formed a partnership with ADC, which is the Amaravati Development Corporation, to develop this area. And this deal is something that I examine closely in the book, but I'm not going into it today. This image shows the area where the seed capital is planned. And you can see, not only how beautiful the area is, it's also a very lush agrarian landscape with multi-crop land, a lot of banana and other rain-fed horticultural crops growing here. And the plan is, of course, to transform this stretch into a prime riverfront property. So between 2015 and 2019, the new capital zone underwent drastic changes. One of the first things the government did as a way of persuading people to participate in land pooling was that they declared that cultivation could not continue from 2015 first season. And as a result, agriculture was largely abandoned, turning this lush agrarian environment into a desolate landscape of fallow fields, dotted with a few construction sites that were scattered very widely across this very large landscape. So this is the chapter scheme of the book. Very briefly, I'll just tell you what all is in it, and then I'll just come and discuss a few of the main arguments. In the introduction, of course, I review some of the relevant literature on urban planning, on mega projects in India, on land resistance to land acquisition, and various other bodies of work that kind of help me to frame my argument conceptually. The first chapter is actually more of a regional, I sketch the regional history and political economy of the region, because one of my arguments is that we can't really understand a lot of what happened with Amaravati if we don't contextualize it within that larger history. The second chapter is where I discuss the master plan, the financial model for the city, some aspects of its implementation that I just went through. The third chapter is about speculation, and as has happened whenever these kind of mega projects are announced in India, one of the first things that takes place is a kind of speculative land boom, as the value of land is anticipated to go up, and so people start coming in to buy up land, driving up prices and so on. So in this chapter, I look at how that background of the speculative land market shaped the project, as well as the strategies of the land pooling farmers as they began to transition into an urban future. Chapter 4, I'm going to talk about in more detail. Here, the main thrust is on the question of what happens to the 29 villages who are basically swallowed up by the master plan. So I look at how CRDA and the state government was thinking about that. I look at what was actually happening in the villages, not only in terms of the space, space and the built form, but especially the impact of this project on different caste and class groups. And I also look at the social development schemes that were formulated by CRDA to try to help out the very large number of families, households that were marginalized by this plan. The fifth chapter focuses on the politics of urban development. Here I look at three main groups and their responses to the Amaravati plan. The first is the land pooling farmers, who we'll talk about more, the ones who agreed to give up the land. Second are those who did not agree and were holdouts, and they were called the LA farmers, land acquisition farmers, because landowners who did not agree to pool were ultimately served with land acquisition notifications. And the third group are Dalits, SC communities that waged the struggle around the issue of assigned lands. Again, I'm not talking about that today, but we can take it up in the questions if someone is interested. Chapter 6, Assetizing the Future, is about what happens with the land pooling scheme and the emergence of a market for the reconstituted plots that farmers were given in return for pooling the land. I'm going to talk about that today a bit more. And the last chapter is on the Save Amaravati movement that emerges in the post-2019 scenario, when Telugu Desam Party is voted out, YSRCP government comes in and basically abandons the project. But that was not the end of things, because the farmers who had given up their land formed this movement and a very strong agitation to save the project. And that is more or less where the book ends. I have not followed up much in the post-2024 scenario, where Telugu Desam Party, as you all know, comes back to power and the project has been revived. So there's a few themes that run through all these chapters, although I'm kind of telling the story in a very kind of structured way. One main theme I'm not going to speak about too much today, but it's a major argument in the book, is how the project built upon and deepened pre-existing structures of caste and class, which are themselves the legacy of the region's agrarian social formation and economy. And that is why I spend time in the first chapter talking about that regional context. Second, through the book are the various kinds of disruptions and conflicts that erupted around the project, and also new political formations and mobilizations that emerged as a result, which I argue also altered relations between some of the citizens and the state. And third is I trace the changing meanings and values of land as agricultural land was converted into urban real estate via the land pooling scheme. So here I'm just going to focus on three of these topics because I can't cover everything today. So first, I'm going to go to the question of the villages. What was the government thinking? What were the planners thinking in terms of what will happen to the villages as the city develops, and what actually was happening in my observation? So as I said, the plan basically swallows up 29 existing villages, which are actually 25 revenue villages, absorbing them into the new city while destroying their primary economic base, which is agriculture. Apart from a few villages where farmers were strongly opposed to land pooling and continued cultivating their land, was allowed to go fallow and most people were thrown out of work. So what does it mean for a settlement to be stripped of its primary means of production and absorbed into a city that is yet to be built? Unlike the gradual urbanization of villages on the edges of expanding metropolises, in Amaravati, what we see is a very abrupt transition. While farmers who pooled their land were largely incorporated into this imagined future because they were to become property owners in the new city, most Rajdhani residents did not own land. In fact, only 30% of households were landowners. So the demise of agriculture rendered landless agricultural workers and tenant farmers surplus to the designs of the master plan, despite the government's promises that the new city would generate new employment opportunities. Most households were left without regular incomes. So then a key problem for the state, which it recognized very well, is what to do about these households. So the CRDA sought to address these issues through by promulgating various social welfare schemes and especially skill training programs with the idea that if we can get people who have been dependent on agriculture to reskill, they can find jobs, if not here, somewhere nearby. In the book, I do discuss the predicament of unemployed youth and as well as the activities of the Social Development Unit of CRDA, which was responsible for these programs. I'm not going to go into details today on that. But what really interested me here also was that whenever I would visit the CRDA or ADCL offices and speak to planners and engineers and so on, I would always ask them, what about the villages? What are you going to do about the villages? You have this beautiful urban plan, but if you look at the planning documents, the villages are almost like blank spots. And I never got a clear or like, a unified answer to that question. And in some sense, I felt that my question was not even understood because I was not asking about what will happen to these settlements as physical or spatial entities, which is how planners tend to think of it, or at least those planners, but as social communities and centers of production and livelihoods. So their responses were always about developing the village infrastructure. There were funds allocated for that. And they would develop the roads and the drainage and so on, and link it to the planned infrastructure of the new city. And also because the government had promised, in order to push through the land pooling scheme, promised that the villages would not be displaced at all, or its people, or their people. So, and yet I got these kind of divergent narratives from CRDA officials and others. They admitted that it's a major planning challenge. They want to upgrade the infrastructure and connect them. And yet they also spoke about the fact that the villages are not in sync with the planned capital. So we're doing village beautification. But many of the farmers had a different view, and they have seen cities like Hyderabad and Bangalore, where often when villages get, incorporated into a village as it grows, they end up as slums or as kind of low-income settlements. They don't really get upgraded. So that was kind of the discussion that was going on. And yet there were others, and especially one of my key informants who was a leader of the land pooling farmers and an enthusiastic supporter of the Amaravati plan. He believed strongly that the village would eventually get upgraded in this way and that CRDA would put money into developing them. And he was very happy because especially in his village, they had started as a kind of pilot project. One time when I went there, I found that what you see here is the old village tank where the buffalo were watered and so on. It had been turned into a very typical kind of urban park with a jogging track around it. They fenced it so the buffalo could no longer go there, and it was supposed to become a kind of a community park. So clearly this kind of a beautification project, and this is the only one of its type that I saw, but it does convey the erasure of an agrarian economy by a middle-class imaginary of a world-class city. The other thing, of course, that happened in the villages, and all of you would have predicted this, is that even though the government wasn't quite sure what it was going to do, the villages already started developing on their own. As farmers used the proceeds from selling land during the boom period to build new housing and especially rental housing. They believed that they could profit from the future demand for residential accommodation in Rajdhani. Rajdhani is what the capital is called locally. because there would be government officials and other people moving in, and they would need, housing. So what we see in these villages, especially the more centrally located ones, and we see this, of course, in peri-urban villages all around India, we find this mushrooming of multi-storied buildings and small apartment blocks built seemingly without any kind of thought for the infrastructure which is already available. Of course, CRDA had issued building codes to control and to guard against this kind of unplanned development, but the rules were easily flouted, and we see these kinds of buildings coming up even on very narrow lanes where cars can hardly enter without parking facilities and so on. So in contrast to the government's intention to integrate the Amaravati villages with the new city through planned development, they were showing signs of unbridled urbanization and incremental informal development, again, as we see in most Indian cities. So next, I want to turn to the question of the land pooling scheme, which was one of my key topics. I think everyone in this audience would know what land pooling is. It's a policy instrument that is increasingly being used by state and municipal governments to acquire land as an alternative to compulsory acquisition. And in a land pooling scheme, owners who surrender their land receive as compensation not cash or not only cash, but a smaller portion of land in the new township with a new development in the form of developed plots. The land remaining with the state after creating these plots, in this case, only about 30% of the land was remaining, is used for infrastructure development and monetized to raise finance by selling plots to investors. Of the 54,000 acres covered in the first phase of the project, 38,000 acres was privately held agricultural land. And most of this, by the way, belonged to small and marginal farmers. But as I mentioned, even though there was strong opposition in some pockets, most farmers soon agreed to pool their land. And by 2017, about 34,000 acres had been handed over. So as I mentioned, even though the government did use coercive measures to persuade farmers to participate in the scheme, such as ordering that cultivation should be stopped, many farmers became enthusiastic supporters of the project, absorbing and articulating the imagination of development that it represented. My conversations with farmers in the capital region villages between 2015 and 2019 indicated that many came to view the project as a prime opportunity for accumulation. And this shift was driven partly by the speculative land boom that I mentioned that had gone along with the announcement of the project. Many landholders had profited from selling a part of their land, and then they later gave the rest for pooling, which they saw as a long-term investment. So I gathered a lot of narratives from landowning households about how they made these decisions and how they tried to balance the uncertainty and the risk of land pooling with their expectations of financial gain from the scheme. It was farmers in the upland villages. In fact, in the Amaravati, within the planning zone, most of the villages are in what's called the upland, where agriculture was mainly rain-fed, and farms were producing just one crop a year. And so they were not lucrative farms, and land values were low. So it was these farmers who were the first to give up their land, while most of the resistance came from villages closer to the river that had irrigated multi-cropped land. Another important reason behind this participation was what locally people talk about. This is not my interpretation, but people speak about this quite openly, was the caste factor. Majority of landowners in most of the Amaravati villages are kammas. Kammas, of course, are the wealthiest and most powerful community in the coastal Andhra region, the biggest landowning community, who are also strong supporters of TDP. And in fact, there's good enough evidence to show that this caste profile was an important reason that this site was selected, as opposed to someplace, say, farther south in Rayalaseema, because the government believed there would be less resistance. As I mentioned, Kammas in general and Kamma farmers here have a very strong faith in Chandrababu Naidu's abilities, and that kind of party and plus caste affiliation really underwrote their participation in this. As a big farmer, as I'm quoting here, a big farmer told me plainly, except for a few, all the villages are Kamma villages. That is why the capital is being constructed here. Had it not been the case, the capital could never have been made here. However, like the land market, land pooling is essentially a speculative mode of land acquisition. It is speculative because it provides adequate compensation to farmers only if the reconstituted plots that they receive attain a higher value than the agricultural land that they surrendered. And the future value of these plots, in turn, depends upon whether the project or the city develops as planned. This means that participating farmers were essentially gambling with their property, betting that at some point in the future they would realize spectacular profits. So in one of the chapters, I talk about the ways in which the state brought these farmers on board. And one of them was that CRDA arranged frequent meetings with landholding farmers to tell them about how the plan was put together, ask for their suggestions, and basically they were being framed as key stakeholders in the project. But what convinced most of the farmers to finally participate is that they engaged in a long series of negotiations with the state government, and including directly with Chandrababu Naidu, to get the land pooling increased. So the land pooling package that was offered in the beginning was not satisfactory to them. And so they bargained for a better package. When they finally got the package, or the formula that they wanted, then they all began to participate. So also because the future value of their compensation plots depended entirely, as I said, on the successful development of the new city, the land pooling, they came to be known as land pooling farmers or capital area farmers. I call them LP farmers. They took an active interest in the progress of the project, keeping close watch over the development of infrastructure and of the new housing layouts where the plots were to be located, and constantly negotiating with CRDA to protect their interests. And so one of the issues after they got the package they wanted, and they had all given their agreements for pooling, one of the main issues was around the design of the new layouts. And in fact, because of their interventions, the planners who were actually creating the detailed master plan, which included the design of all of these individual layouts, had to go back to the drawing board time and again because of the objections that were being raised by the farmers. So finally, after taking into account all of their inputs, the detailed master plan was finalized and to accommodate the compensation plots in 24 residential layouts scattered across the city. After executing the land pooling agreement, the next step is that the plots were allotted through a computerized lottery system, and nearly 65,000 plots were allotted to the participating landowners. So it is through this process that I argue in the book that these land pooling farmers began to reimagine themselves or reconstitute themselves as propertied urban citizens. For them, the compensation plots were both bearers of potential financial value as well as symbol of the anticipated urban future. And they began to develop this sense of ownership and investment in the new city. And that also resulted in a collective identity and collective mobilization around the idea of Amaravati, which also had become a symbol of the new state, buoyed by patriotic sentiment in the wake of bifurcation. When I asked farmers what they planned to do with these plots, most spoke about constructing modern urban-style houses in the new well-designed layouts, where they would be able to enjoy the kinds of amenities that are lacking in their villages. But most, in fact, sold off one or several of their compensation plots to cash in on their value when the market was high, and held on to a few, perhaps in anticipation of selling them later when property values went up, and keeping just one or two prime sites for their own use. So this now brings me to my third main theme. Champaka, you can cut me off if I'm taking too long. I have about 8 slides left.
We have 15 minutes more.
Okay, I should be fine. So soon after the plot allocation happened, a market for these Amaravati plots emerged. And this was stimulated and I would say, in a kind of enabled by the launch of this app called the Mana Amaravati app, which has many different services in it, but basically it also allows for these plots to be bought and sold online. So these plots, which actually at the time the market emerged, were essentially just digital assets. They did not have a physical existence on ground, but they began to circulate they became, there was a lot of demand that emerged very quickly, and they began to circulate on this online market. So to understand this, in the book, I invoke the concept of assetization, by which we basically mean when you convert a good or a property into a financial asset to make it tradable in the market. And when land is transformed by assetization, by subjecting it to financial markets, it means is actively being restructured for investment and, as I said, profit generation. So in the book, I try to develop this argument that what land pooling actually did in Amaravati was to transform long-standing property rights in agricultural land into dematerialized financial assets that could produce substantial value only through circulation. And this market that developed for these plots demonstrates this. And the reason why I say these assets were not only abstract, but also dematerialized is because the Amaravati plots, for even now, I'm not sure about the situation now, but up to the time I was doing field work, they actually did not have physical coordinates or material existence on ground. And yet they were circulating in this market for quite high prices. What the land pooling farmers received through the lottery was not a title to a specific plot of land. It was a digital certificate on which the assigned plot was represented by a code number corresponding to a rectangle on the sketch map of the relevant layout plan. But these numbers did not correspond to clearly identifiable plots on ground because the land survey for the layouts and the physical demarcation of plots had not been completed. That procedure, which is called peg marking. And I won't go into details, but there were various reasons why the peg marking process was hindered. One of them had to do with the CRDA's decision to deploy a new GIS-based survey system, satellite system, that did not jibe well with the existing land records and maps and so on. So it created many discrepancies and conflicts between CRDA and farmers when their plots were being measured. So basically, my argument is that land pooling transformed property rights in agricultural land, which of course have been there for many decades, into abstract digitized financial assets. And yet these assets did not correspond to any material piece of property on ground. And I found this quite unusual because normally, even when we're talking about land titles or any other kind of document referring to land, you can point to an actual, piece of land that has some spatial coordinates or a material piece of property. And so I found this quite unusual, and I try to discuss in the book, what this actually signifies in terms of how do we understand this model of development. So even though they did not have this material existence, the Amaravati plots were selling for as much as 45,000 rupees per square yard at the peak of the market in 2019. These are rates higher than you see in most cities and regional towns of the state. So naturally, when I would visit between 2017 and 2019, a lot of the talk that I heard in the villages was all about the prevailing rates for the plots, how many plots were being bought and sold, at what price, etc. So I began to think of this market as, at least for the LP farmers and the people who had bought plots, it became a key index of the development of the project as a whole. Because infrastructure was being built very slowly, there were a lot of hitches in the project. But this was one kind of indicator for many people that the city was developing as planned. Because for them, the market price, if the prices were falling, it was a sign the project was in trouble. If they were rising, for them, it was a good sign. Of course, the essentially speculative character of these plots became starkly visible, following the elections of 2019, when TDP lost to the YSR Congress Party, led by YS Jagannath Reddy, and the new government virtually abandoned the Amaravati project. As the YSRCP government floated the idea of distributed capital or having 3 capital cities across the state, instead of just one, almost all infrastructure work in Rajdhani was halted or slowed down. Investors and funding agencies pulled out. And at this point, the market for Amaravati plots collapsed, erasing most of the value they had gained and making it clear that the inherent risks of the project had been transferred mainly to the farmers who had pooled the land. So the consequence was Rajdhani turned into a desolate landscape of unfinished roads, skeletons of half-constructed buildings, and large expanses of fallow, barren land. But this was not the end of the story. As I mentioned, these developments really galvanized the LP farmers, as well as the people who had invested in Rajdhani, to challenge the new government's decisions. And that crystallized into the Save Amaravati movement, which I discussed in the last chapter. In their slogans and court filings, the language used by the movement was basically, the basic argument was that the state government has made a commitment. They have signed a contract with us. We have kept our part of the contract by handing over our land, and now the state is not holding up its part. And of course, the main legal argument that they made is that just because the government has changed, that doesn't mean that its commitment has been abrogated. And so the movement itself is very interesting, because here what we see is, a movement, unlike most of the movements against land acquisition or other kinds of farmers' movements, we see farmers basically mobilizing around the alienation of their land, or around this idea of moving from an agrarian life into an urban lifestyle based on property, of course. The latest twist to the story, of course, is the return to power of TDP in May 2024. We know that the state government has revived the Amaravati project on a war footing. The fact that it came back to power in alliance with the BJP has helped a lot, I believe. And they have promised that all the infrastructure work will be completed within 3 years. They have now support from the central government. The World Bank loan that was dropped earlier has been sanctioned. New tenders are being issued for the construction works and so on. I have not been there. I've only been back once since this happened, so I don't have a lot to say about this recent phase. But I'm going to conclude now just with coming back to the main, or I think the bigger questions that I think this project raises. Even though the project seems to be back on track, the inherent contradictions and tensions remain unresolved, I would bet. In its quest for economic growth and development, the state has positioned the world as the domain of backwardness or of the past. It's a domain that needs to be brought into the future through urbanization, through modern infrastructure, and by moving away from agriculture. But the Amaravati plan has no place for most of the inhabitants of the villages, even as landowners have been transformed into urban property owners who are invested in this new future. So the question for discussion is, or one of the questions is, what lessons might this Amaravati project hold for thinking about India's urban future, which, if the current pattern continues, will be built upon the graveyards of agrarian communities? This will not happen simply by erasing them, but by incorporating and reinventing existing structures of power through the assetization of land and the commoditization of rural landscapes. So more broadly, the Amaravati story also points to a dramatic break in the meanings and social relations that constitute land, as it was assetized and channeled into transnational circuits of accumulation. This transformation points to the new pathways of accumulation that may be created by mega projects such as Amaravati, as property rights in agricultural land, which are in fact structured by the colonial legacy of caste-embedded land governance, are converted into digitized abstract assets that begin to produce value mainly through circulation. So that's the end, and acknowledgements. Thank you very much.
Champaka, you are mute.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you
Thanks,
for that
Ganesh.
absolutely fascinating presentation. And, we've been discussing your work and also Amravati over the last few weeks, particularly this morning as well. One other book that sort of came to our mind was Tanya Lee's book, which is named Land's End: Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier, where Lee discusses the emergence of capitalist relationships among indigenous highlanders in Indonesia, and who privatized their common land to plant a sort of cocoa crop, boom crop. And then in this book, she discusses essentially how, while some were spurred by the hope of ending their poverty, others actually were quite optimistic about this whole monetization of land for a boom crop. And some even prospered, and they actually quite proactively engaged in striking those negotiations, etc. And of course, she makes a case for why this form of capitalist production is untenable, because of there's compensation which is never which is not addressing the deeper social relationships. And your book discusses, on the other hand, how the land pooling scheme, for instance, in Amravati, is actually a response to it actually spurred this whole idea of spurred the culture of business, and it sort of was dominant. This period was dominated by speculative finance capital, and marked by sort of a search for super profits, as you articulate in your book, through high risk investments. And one sees that there's this oscillation between promoting land and as the capitalist mode of production of the city, and then capital was interrupted and then again resurrected due to political sort of cycles. And so before we throw it open to our audiences online and audiences at the CPR office, we'd love to hear what your views are on this future of this form of uncertain urbanization, which is what your book is about.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I do cite Tanya Lee's work, I think, quite a bit in the book, and many anthropologists have done so because she frames this whole problem of land very well. And I also took from her this theme that I try to pursue when I talk about the changing meanings and values of land. I don't mean this simply in a very abstract way, but the point is to trace how the idea is that land is not just something physical which sits there, right? It is always imbued with different types of meanings or relations to the community, which could have to do with production. It has to do with property. It has to do with culture and history and everything else. And I think that is why when we focus on land, it kind of spirals outwards into many other questions when we look at projects like this. And about speculation, as you know, I mean, the other recent book that we did, which was on Bangalore, revolves around this concept of speculative urbanism, which Michael Goldman has put forth, which has to do with, this is not just about Amaravati or Bangalore, it has to do with this era of finance capital that has kind of taken over the entire global economy, and many books have been written about this. But the mechanics of it really have to do with financialization and assetization of commodities and land and property, such that financial value that is being generated has very little link to the actual materiality or the productive value of those goods. And that is what many theorists have tried to engage with. And what we see again, and this can be debated, of course, is that this is affecting the growth of Indian cities as well, where you have large investments, for example, going into high-end commercial real estate or residential real estate, and much less interest in creating, low-income and middle-class housing. And that, was accompanied by all the kinds of urban, kind of unbridled urban growth and, urban chaos that we all talk about. So I think all of these things are interlinked. And Amaravati is an unusual case, as I said, because of its size, because the idea of building an entire new city out of nowhere. So in some ways, it's probably not a good example to take if we're talking about urban future in general. But I think it does open up many questions.
Indeed. We have several questions trickling in online, and we had started off with about 100 participants.
Wow.
So we're looking forward to some exciting discussions here. There's Dhanya Rajgopal, who says we're a group of independent participatory designers, urban planners, and urban sociologists from Andhra Pradesh, Chennai, and California. We've studied the potential and gaps of Amaravati's place identity and urban infrastructure, like their public life and public spaces, social spaces for youth and children, integrating identity and belonging in Amaravati's neighborhoods. While the government is focusing on macro scale, we're looking at the hyper-local scale and participatory projects. How ready or willing do you think the government is to incorporate such pilot projects at the micro scale? Are the so-called principles of happy city and people's capital ideas that the city brands itself through truly being incorporated at the policy and design level? What are some suggestions you may have while approaching decision makers with our pilot ideas?
Thanks. That's a very interesting intervention. I think, the project does need a lot of independent ideas and actors to come in and make suggestions. And as I said, I haven't been there since much since the new government came back. So I'm not really sure if their thinking has changed. My sense from my earlier work is that they are very wedded to the master plan the way it was designed. Even the farmers who gave up their land are wedded to that because they say that, this is how our plots will attain value. So if you're talking about working with the villages, I think there would be scope because, as I said, there seems to be a big gap there in terms of that imagination of what will happen with the villages and the people in them, of course. But the problem is it's a very complicated, issue because, like any agrarian village in India, they are multi-caste, they are multi-class. There's a lot of marginalized people who have very few resources. And then there are people with their own kind of imaginations and perspectives on what should happen. So I don't know how easy it would be to kind of get people together around a particular idea or plan, if you're looking at that scale. But I would be interested to get in touch and hear more about this. Thank you.
Yes, the plan, in fact, seems to include, it seems to respond to all the national standards for allocating land for public purpose, but one needs to see how this really plays out as the city gets going for implementation in its different phases. And there are question marks there, of course. There's a compliment and a question by Udisha Saklani. Thanks for a fantastic talk, Carol. I was struck by the Save Amaravati movement where farmers mobilized to keep a development project rather than oppose it. What do you think this says about how aspirations are reshaping development politics? Is this something you're seeing more widely beyond the Amaravati case? Very, very much a question that I had as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was exactly, I think the argument in the chapter is that this project, once it has these, land pooling farmers on board, it certainly reshapes aspirations. And even though it's not in the form of a movement, I think we see similar. I mean, another piece of work I've done is on villages on the outskirts of Bangalore that are in the process of, urbanizing. And we don't see political movements. Of course, we see resistance to acquisition, but when the government wants to take land compulsorily, and it's happening right now on the new projects, the Mysore, the peripheral ring road and so on. But at the same time, all across India, we see that farmers are more and more willing to engage with the market. So if they have a chance to sell land very often at a decent price, they will do so. What they don't want is to be forced to give up land at a compensation that is not adequate. And to me, that is also, I mean, a lot of the argument about that is that people are willing to sell land because agriculture is no longer remunerative, there's an agrarian crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of what I see also is exactly this urban aspiration, especially villages close to cities. Many people have already left farming. Many the young people have already gotten, educated and they're working as software engineers or whatever. So it's that rural to urban transition that's happening in a slower way. Here, as I said, it was very abrupt. And because that development was cut off with the change of government, the farmer, I mean, I cannot tell you how upset and angry and disappointed they were when I went there the first time in 2019. Because they felt the entire rug has been pulled out from under them, right? I mean, all of their future is staked on this project. So the mobilization was really interesting, but it was around this idea of citizenship and a very interesting notion that what is citizenship? It's a contract between the citizen and the state. And that is something I think which is fairly new, and it maybe underwrites some of the urban middle class activism that we see also in India. I haven't thought about it to that extent, but perhaps we could extend that argument there also.
Sure, there are other thoughts. There's Birch Gadde, who says Save Amravati is by TDP supporters and real estate business people, also supported by the Kama caste. This is the reality. And they go on to say also that there are no real farmers in Amravati. In one of our visits, in fact, we heard that it's that the land, a large part of the land that has been taken up is largely belongs to absentee landlords. So there's multiple dynamics there. Butch Gadde also says, I hope I'm pronouncing their name right. Thank you, Carol, for the presentation of your research. What could be the maximum limit for land pooling in a given area? This makes That's the first question. Then this makes governments liable, which is challenging when it comes to governments. That comes every 5 years once. How ethical is land pooling in that context?
Right. Okay, so hi, I think I know who this is. So I don't disagree. You're absolutely right. A lot of the land, I forgot to mention, did change hands at the time of the land boom. We don't have data because obviously a lot of this is under the table cash transactions. A lot of people say that that we know that farmers sold land. A lot of it was bought up by, TDP politicians or film stars or, big businessmen and so on. And so a lot of the critics of the project say that land pooling worked because these were the first people to go and give their land for pooling. So I don't disagree with this. I know that this happened. But my analysis comes from talking to people, and especially women who were at the forefront of the movement. And the ones I interviewed were all from small landholding households. They were families that had 3 acres, 5 acres, and for them it was a very difficult decision to go for land pooling because it is their family legacy, right? I mean, to just give that up and on the bet that in the future, they will have more valuable property was very difficult. And I have those narratives. And so, I think both things were happening at once. The movement, yes, TDP is behind it, yes, Kammas. But it's interesting too, again, many of my, interlocutors in the village, when I went back after, they had these 2 huge padayatras across the state. And I went and spoke to people who had been part of that. They talked about the fact that they knew they had to convince the rest of the people in the state that their sacrifice, that they're not agitating only for their own benefit. Their line was that we have sacrificed our land for the good of the whole state. And they talked about how people in other districts, as the Padayatra was moving through, really listened to them and supported them and gave donations and all that. Now, again, that is one side of the story. The other side of the story is also there to be told. But to me, it was still very significant that, that they could mobilize in this way. And they did win a very major high court decision around that, right? That the second point that you made is that their main point, and this is what the high court decision says, is that if an agreement for land pooling or anything else has been made by the state government, it cannot just be abrogated because there's a new government in place. And that is what they are counting on going forward. And that's true for any investor, right? That Singapore government or the Singapore investors were very upset because they were basically pushed out after the government changed, right? And they had put money into the seed capital project. And they also said that how can, we've signed this agreement, how can this just change just because there's a new government? So it makes investors wary. And I think supposedly there's more stability now around these issues.
Yes. Other related thoughts here. There's further comments about how, Butch Gadev goes on to say that the surprising fact is international finance institutions such as the World Bank and ADB are funding and financing real estate markets. Personally, I would see that differently, but would you like to share thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, World Bank and ADB, et cetera, finance these projects because I think there is a real serious policy idea that this is how development is going to happen, right? And what they are financing is the infrastructure and so on, with the idea that that will then attract capital investment. Now, are they financing real estate directly? Or, I mean, yes, indirectly they are. But, there's another part to this I didn't talk about today, which in the second chapter, I tried to look at the financial model of this project and its links with real estate. And there my point is that you have, and this goes back to the question of master planning, right? You have a planned area and everything has been mapped out, what is going to happen there, what kind of funding will come. And the model is also that the government will start selling some of the land it has gathered to investors. So that's why we have already, I think, 3 or 4 universities functioning. Investors make a proposal, they are allocated land, and they start their work, hospital, university, whatever it might be. And that is how the government is supposed to raise some finance. But what happened even before 2019 is that nothing else was happening because no investor wanted to come in, or hardly any investor wanted to come in because the infrastructure was not ready. And there were many projects being proposed for, shopping malls, hotels, 5-star hotels, etc. But nobody will put up a project, a real estate project, unless there's a road, unless there's electricity, etc. So the point I make in that part of the chapter is that Amaravati is not developing in that sense. There's no real estate happening there. But all around the edge of the project, all around the perimeter, on the Guntur-Vijayawada highway and all the major, roads, there's rampant real estate development. Because, and again, this is what happens with all of these type of mega projects, is they set off a real estate boom, if not within the planned area, because it's so controlled around it. And that is what one could argue is unplanned development, because even though there may be planning norms, etc., it seemed like it was just growing, like sprouting like weeds. And that is where the real estate investment is happening. So my point is that indirectly, yes, it's benefiting real estate capital. Directly, not so much yet.
Also, if I recall in your book, you say that there's quite a lot of domestic capital, which is actually...
Well, and yeah, there's all domestic
funded.
capital. In fact, my argument here is really about provincial capital. I'm talking about Andhra capital. I'm not talking much about, investors from Bombay and Delhi, et cetera, coming in. It's very much regional capital, which is another, I think, very interesting point, that a lot of writing about these world city type of projects keeps on talking about global capital. But that's, World Bank is a drop in the bucket, really. It's just a kind of a support system for the project while it gets going.
Yes, several thoughts that I resonate with from what you shared, Carol. Shrikant has several questions and many comparisons with the Chinese model. There's one question. Most of their questions are pertaining to the land pooling scheme. So Amaravati's land pooling scheme fundamentally relies on returning a fraction of developed commercial and residential real estate to farmers, expecting that urban land value escalation will outpace agricultural yield. Looking at China's urbanized villages or collective land conversions, how can APCRDA build explicit institutional safeguards to ensure that local farmers don't immediately liquidize assets to speculative external developers, thereby losing their generational stake in the city's economic future?
Right. So this is really interesting. I mean, that's where I spoke about the market for the plots. In the beginning, there was a prohibition on selling your allocation, your plot. But there was a lot of demand, and so the government decided to allow it. And that's where we saw a lot of plots changing hands. But that market, interestingly, is not going to, could not create the kind of scenario that you were talking about, where bigger developers and all come in, precisely because the plots are all fairly small, including the commercial plots. So there was some discussion, and the CRDA actually at one point organized a meeting between land pooling farmers and local builders, trying to see if they could amalgamate plots. So if I'm a builder and I want to come in to put something up in the city, I need enough area. And the only way to get that would be to buy up a few plots and amalgamate them. But that was not permitted. And the CIDA was trying to see if they could, formulate a system whereby that could happen to get the developers to come in. But the farmers did not agree. So again, the plots themselves are not going to lead to any rampant real estate development. They are circulating right now just in this market. Now, what will happen later, I don't know. Maybe when the city really develops, somebody will come in and buy up 20 plots from the market and put them together if the rules allow it. But even the so-called commercial plots are really meant for things like small, shopping complexes and so on, not big commercial properties. The big investments are supposed to come from the land that CRDA is allocating. So like it gave land to SRM University, it gave land to, VIT, like that. It wants to allocate land for these bigger projects, in return for which it gets, some payment. I don't know if that quite answered the question, but
we could request Shrikant to join us among the moderators to engage in more discussion if they'd like. But there's also questions at our office at CPR. Over to you,
Yes.
Srinivas.
Yes, thank you, Chandrika. Carol, thank you for this fantastic talk. I mean, I've always been an admirer of your work, really grounded and deeply perceptive. Just wanted to pick up on the question that you yourself have posed at the end of the talk. Does Amaravati offer some kind of insights into the India's urban futures? Does it really? Because you have articulated very clearly, there's plenty of exceptional aspects to Amaravati. As you can see, it's a greenfield city. And then you've got a situation where the chief minister himself going down and negotiating with the farmers, and the farmers sustaining their resistance so long, and then not only just negotiating great package, but also to wait for the government to sort of turn around and basically come back with this implementation plan. So does it really give you a sense that there are things that we can learn from Amaravati, and particularly given that I want to lean on your work, on farmer capitalists within coastal Andhra, something a brilliant piece of work, just to sort of help you reflect on it. Do you think that it would have worked the way it has worked if Amaravati was located anywhere else other than Central? Right? See, the ability of the farmer capitalists to basically negotiate with the government and remain so resilient to get the package. Now, perhaps it may even eventually work out. So just going back to that question about, does it really offer things about, something that we can learn for India's urban futures? Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much. I mean, this is actually, I think, precisely my argument, and why I talk a lot about the regional context is because I think it is very unusual. I think if it had been anywhere else, maybe it would never have taken off. And a lot of factors had to come together to kind of create that context where farmers are, amenable to this idea, where, the political caste and other equations, kind of money comes together. But I do talk about, similar examples we can pick up. And again, it has to do with those regions where, and often the Green Revolution regions where at least one, one section of farmers made money, start to diversify, become very entrepreneurial. A similar case has been studied by Sai Balakrishnan for the Marathas, right, in Maharashtra, which is the name is escaping me, the township outside of Pune, where farmers actually got together and themselves pooled their land and created a real estate project. So I think it's very region specific, but I think there are other regions where you find a similar kind of a dynamism where farmers are increasingly interested in capitalizing on their control over land. And we see it also, to get into this kind of a business, whether it's real estate or, something related. And we see it in the villages around Bangalore as well. So, there is that kind of transition that is happening, and I think it would happen in different ways. So the Amaravati model is probably not, very likely to. I think the city itself is not going to take off. If you ask me personally, maybe after 50 years we'll see something. But as a model, no, I think it's really problematic because, for all the reasons I mentioned, and any other place that you think of this kind of greenfield city has probably worked in places where there are satellite cities like Gandhinagar, for example. So there's already an existing city, and what you're doing is creating a kind of a planned development where only certain kinds of functions are happening. This is a very different animal. And it's really hard to envision how it's actually going to shape up in the next 10 or 20 years.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the office in CPR?
Fine. Right. Yeah.
Hi, Carol. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I remember I had met you earlier also, and you had made this presentation. I was very impressed. And at that time, I think I used to teach at the School of Planning and Architecture, and Amaravati case at that time being planned was a live case study that students would study, and it was the ideal, the dream city, and one never thought it would fail. But when the project was cancelled, I wonder what is the cost of this kind of failed projects to the society? What is the damage? If it was not resurrected as it is, how would you look at this? What would be the loss? How would you estimate that loss? Because you have watched this process from the start until the time when it was shelved. That's a question. Second one is more an observation, and that relates to what does it mean for India's urban future. India's urban future is not going to see many cities planned like this. It is extremely high cost. You need a big champion. You need loads of money and political support. India's urban future is in thousands and thousands of smaller cities that are coming up organically or coming up with some support from the government. And of late, it's the government's policy to support growth hubs, which are regional. So, in my opinion, that's India's urban future, not Amravati and likes of Amravati. You may comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you entirely. I mean, and I don't want to state these things very boldly because as a researcher, I, try to just talk about what I see, but I always thought it's really going to be, it's just overblown. It's not practical. It's very expensive. And to me, I guess one of the problems is why is there such a failure of imagination? If you need a new capital city or you want to stimulate economic growth, surely there are other ideas out there one could think of which don't have to do with these kind of very grandiose planning models that we see, in fact, all over Asia nowadays, from Nusantara to, basically this idea of new capital cities has just taken hold. And why? This goes back to the earlier comment. There is a lot of, stake here for, certain kinds of global capital also. So no, this is not the model, and the loss is, incalculable because you've basically destroyed the economies of 29 villages, right? And very few people are getting any benefit out of that, and you've destroyed agriculture over this entire region. If the city does come up and create new opportunities, that's a different matter, but that hasn't, that's going to take, as I said, a long time. So I think what I'm looking for from planners and policymakers is more different imaginaries of what can be done. And you're right. I mean, urban growth in India has always been incremental, and it continues to be incremental, whether it's in a big city or a small town. So the problem then becomes is how to manage that, right, in a way that creates, governable and equitable urban spaces. I think that's the problem that we're facing in Bangalore and so many cities now.
There's a question. There are a couple of questions pertaining to the natural environment Sonali Chauhan says, "Hi, Carol, amazing presentation. Wanted to ask how nature features in this new urban future of Amaravati." And there's a related question from Shrikant after that, but over to you to respond to Sonali, please.
Okay. Yeah, so I do also talk in the book about the fact that right in the beginning, some of the local people who were critical of the project pointed out that it is on a floodplain. At least part of the land is, regularly subjected to flooding every 2 or 3 years or so through the Kondaviri Wagu, because it's, on a slope from the hills, the rain comes through towards the Krishna River. And so a lot of people talked about, question like, how can you build a city in a place like this? And the plan is, this is about, to me, the nature question has to do with the landscape. And the planners were very well aware of this. And so they integrated, a very sophisticated flood management plan into the whole thing. That plan is also very expensive. It's not been fully implemented. And some of the infrastructure and key institutions have to actually raise the bed level of the land to do that. So there's a lot of question mark here about why would you even try to build a city in a place that requires so much of engineering just to get the landscape right. So to me, what I write about in the book is I call it a struggle, or a landscape of value struggles, where people have different notions or different values which are attached to land and landscape, which includes the kind of agrarian vision of the land as being permeated by water, where water has to be marshaled and taken care of and sequestered in order for life to go on. That whole understanding gets erased when you come in with a master plan like this, which basically doesn't really recognize that. And there were many critics in the beginning also who talked about the loss of productive agriculture, which I mentioned, and the riverfront, especially the land that has a lot of access. So the master plan talks about a blue-green city, and it has all this latest, environmental planning kind of models in it, in terms of they want to use that excess water and create these meandering waterways through the city, which will also lead into reservoirs, which will become urban lakes, etc. The whole plan is there in place to have a lot of greenery, etc. But to do that plan, you've erased already what's quite a lush landscape, right? That's built around agriculture. So to me, that's, I would say, one of my main critiques of this whole project. Not only me, of course.
A related question from Shrikant. Shrikant, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Carol. I am just thinking out loud now. In case of land pooling system or schemes, there are always these binaries of land pooling versus outright acquisition is what we are at now. Can we move beyond this binary? Is my question. Where we design a securitized land trust model where we can imagine a framework where the agrarian asset is transferred for long-term urban development, but never permanently is alienated or sold. Because for a farmer, it is the core of his entire life and generations to come. So just paying out some amount at that point of time is not a suitable solution, is what I wanted to express. And that's a wonderful example that you quoted, ma'am. The Magarpata city, yes, there is a continuous dividend stream that goes to the farmers. The other binary that I wanted to discuss was this connect between the land use and the land ownership. So when such large models are presented, not all farmers' land is converted into commercial, or not all farmers' land is converted into residential. There is again this binary of land ownership and land use. So in cases of farmers whose land is designated as commercial, they are benefiting more than the other farmers who were part of the larger agrarian ecosystem. So these were the two things that I wanted to mention. And there a probability curve that we can develop to look at some income or real time commercial yield, and then look at a paradigm where we speculate this kind of uncompromised economic floor for farming families, which will ensure their stakeholder idea and shareholder idea in the urban future of India. So that is what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. The first question about creating a trust rather than this kind of the individual compensation. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how that would work, because if you're thinking of something like what they've done in Magapatta, where you're getting shares in the development rather than, specific pieces of land, maybe it would have, I mean, what you're then telling farmers is you give up your land and you get this like a share certificate. You're not getting an actual plot, right? But I wonder whether that would have convinced farmers to participate. I don't know how that would work out, because a share certificate is even more abstract than those plot certificates that they got. And I don't know if that has been tried anywhere. I don't know of any examples of that. And about the commercial versus residential, et cetera. In the case of Amaravati, as you probably know, every farmer got some portion of commercial plot and residential plot. It's not that particular pieces of land were being, it's not like I've given my land and my land is designated for commercial and therefore I'm getting more. That's not the way it worked. So all the land is pooled and then it's divided into these layouts, and then you are getting your compensation in terms of, X area of commercial property and Y of residential. And one footnote to that is that, about this idea of a land trust or a shareholding instead of actual land, is that one of the big issues that the farmers fought with the government about is that in the initial plan, they were going to get allocated their compensation plots anywhere within the master plan area. And the farmers said, nothing doing. I want a plot in my own village. So, again, there's this transition from a kind of agrarian imagination of what is land and what is the village, what is my home, to the city. And from the planner's point of view, why does it matter? As long as you get a plot anywhere, it will have the same kind of value. Why do you care? But the farmers were very adamant about that. And the consultants had to really go back to the drawing board and redo all the layouts, because it was a very difficult logistic exercise to figure out how to give, those 100 land pooling farmers in this village, how to give them all the plots, that they're being allocated in the layout that is being made on that village. In fact, they had no plan to make this many layouts in the beginning. But they had to redesign the whole thing so that people could say, okay, I got my plots like next to where my village is. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that, people are very wedded to this idea of location also, which has to do with where they come from. And so then saying, okay, you're not getting land, you're going to get a share certificate that will give you an income stream in the future. I think that would be a hard sell in most cases.
There's also another question which Shrikant had in relation to the blue-green matrix and the environmental concern. He says Amaravati has dedicated up to 60% of its core footprint to a blue-green matrix, particularly to manage floodplains like the Kondaviti Vagu. Considering the high upkeep costs seen in China's state-funded eco-cities before they achieve high density, what financial mechanisms or municipal bond structures should Amaravati deploy to sustain this massive ecological infrastructure during its initial low occupancy gestation period? These are big questions, of course.
Yeah. I can only say that's a very important question, because, as I said, it's a very expensive infrastructure. It's not just to be built, but to be maintained. I don't know what the planners have in mind for income stream. Maybe Champaka, as a planner, can answer that question, because for me, there is no revenue model overall until, a lot more projects come up, and then there's maybe some tax revenue or something. They have sold bonds, I believe, but I don't know how they're doing.
These are not easy responses, so I will refrain from commenting on this. But of course, there's much literature on blended finance mechanisms, market-led mechanisms that can provide long-term solutions to infrastructure financing gaps. And of course, there's also an equal amount of literature on the ambivalence in the allocation of financial risks across public and private sector agencies that are partners or shareholders in these financial mechanisms. So we could just reflect on some of these broader questions about risks, I suppose. There's still yet another question on, it's a comparative question again, and with regard to China. Shrikant again says, what explicit policy incentives will ensure global institutional anchors occupy the thematic sub-cities rapidly enough to prevent a Chinese-style planning lag? It goes on to say that note plus all questions based on analogies between Amaravati's blueprint and China's mega-scale greenfield urban experiments, such as Xiaowang, New Area, Shenzhen, or Pudong.
Yeah, again, I'm not really the person to. I don't actually know that much about the Chinese experience. I should probably have read more, because it was a model. Although Naidu never talks about China, he talks about Singapore, Dubai, etc. So again, I don't think from the planning point of view, I'm really equipped to answer that. Sorry. The financial mechanisms, again, I mean, the way it looks right now, it's really a catch-22, because the big investors don't want to come in until there's enough infrastructure ready. Infrastructure costs money. Now that World Bank loan has come, etc., maybe that will happen. But I do remember a conversation with one of the planners from Singapore who was very critical of the way in which the government was handing out or sanctioning projects, because if you see the first projects that came up are all scattered in different corners of the whole area. There's, SRM is this side and VIT is on the other side, and they're literally not even connected. There's no road even. There's nothing around them. And he was arguing that you should be fostering development first in one smaller area, and then it will go outward from there, because there will be synergies, etc. But they have just chosen to start in all these different, corners. And I don't know what the thinking behind that was. There was a lot of allegations, again, about corruption, the usual thing about, who gets the project, who gets the land, which I really haven't looked into that much.
Moving on to a range of other questions, there's still quite a few questions. Bhanu Joshi says, how should we think about the political basis of support for Amaravati? Land pooling gave landowners a stake in the future of the city, understandable. So is it then mainly a comma/TDP caste political coalition, or as a broader landowner coalition that happened to be organized through caste? Would similarly placed non-comma landowners have behaved differently, become supporter of the projects, or was there something specifically comma/TDP about the support?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. It's difficult to answer. I would say yes, it was very much a comma/TDP thing. But I say that because the five or six villages where there was and continues to be resistance are the non-comma villages. They're almost all either dominated by Reddis or by some OBC communities. So everyone said, look, they're only opposing it because it's a comma project. But those same villages are also the ones located near the river that have the most lucrative agriculture. And their narrative was that we don't want to give up. Look, our land is already worth this much. We don't want to give up this livelihood. And two of the main opposing villages, Penumaka and Undavali, are the villages that you come to right when you've entered from the Vijayawada side. And they are already almost peri-urban in character. They have buildings, multi-story buildings. They have a lot of rental economy overflow from the city, etc. So their argument was that our land is already worth a lot more. And when Amaravati was declared, our land values went down. So I have never been able to really disentangle the caste factor from these other interests, which are like really obvious and really important. So caste plays a role in the opposition, but more than that, I think was the economic interest of those villages. But the other part of it is that the larger caste divide in the state, right, aligns very neatly with parties. So we have TDP and we have YSRCP, Kammas and Reddys, and the Kamma Reddy political rivalry has been there for a very long time. And it's also rooted in region. So you cannot discount those factors as well. And like I said, I mean, why did Jagan want to scuttle the project? Why would he build a project in the Kamma heartland? It wouldn't make any sense for him at all, right? So I think we need to take seriously these kind of political commitments as well, even though we might think that, this should not affect urban planning, et cetera, but it does very much, because it's all about, where money gets invested, who can make money out of projects, et cetera. So, and every party will cater to its support base, obviously.
There's a question by Eric Leclerc from France. Considering the first steps of development of Amaravati with unplanned urbanization around NH16, the Guntur-Vijayawada highway, and strict urban planning within Amaravati limits, is there a risk of Brasilia-type urban divided development? Which sort of links to what you were sharing earlier.
Yeah, I would say definitely so. And in fact, for me, one of the first really deep anthropological studies of this kind of planned development was James Holston's book on Brasilia, right? Which, the modernist city, which shows very clearly that, carving out these kind of planned spaces in a context where, the settlements are very different and development takes place in a very different way. It just creates these divisions rather than, actually stimulating some type of, equitable urbanization. And that's why, yes, I gave the example of the highway where you have all these flats and all mushrooming and this kind of empty land just next to it, which is Amaravati. And whether that will be sustained or whether the government might change the planning rules, the planning norms to allow a bit more incremental urbanization, I think that's why it goes back to the question of the villages, which to me will be the source of urbanization if it's allowed to happen, because it's already happening.
Again, a question related to new towns. Ambassador Ashok Athri, who says, thank you very much for a very informative discussion. I look forward to reading the book. What is different in the initial land acquisition and of Chandigarh compared to this project for a new state capital? Chandigarh city was developed successfully, but I have no idea how the original landowners were treated there.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think I can answer that question. Maybe Champaka knows. I assume it was some type of direct land acquisition, because that's kind of the only instrument which was there in those days, but I don't really know. And also, from what I read about Chandigarh, is that, again, it's a planned city, but it did not develop as planned. Not entirely, and there's a lot of work around that, because even these planned layouts, etc., always kind of evolve into something else over time, because urbanization being a very complex process, right? It's not that you can just, create this plan on paper and say, okay, this is how things are going to happen. It never works out like that exactly. So Chandigarh, I think, it has the spatial layout, et cetera, of the plan, but it has a lot of other things happening as well.
And again, related to infrastructure and development, sort of driven by infrastructure, Anjali Sharma says, if our current idea of development prioritizes expansion, efficiency, and city-focused infrastructure, why has this model become so dominant? Why do we continue to see infrastructure as primarily urban, even though cities depend on surrounding rural systems? What might change if we begin to view infrastructure as part of a shared regional ecology instead? And how could we better integrate existing rural systems into planning to build a more balanced rural-urban relationship?
Thanks. Yeah, again, I think a lot of these questions are things that planners and urban policy people are better equipped to talk about. But I think there is one, I mean, it's a really an important question because there's this long legacy of this rural-urban split in India, right? Both in terms of governance and well, mainly in terms of governance, but also political representation. So I think it makes it very difficult to deal with this transition where there's all these kind of gray areas in between. We've seen it in all the cities as they grow into the, rural areas. So but urban planners, I know, maybe Champaka can answer, because I know it's always urban and regional planning. Nobody just talks about planning the city, they talk about the region. But maybe the linkages and all which are envisioned or which are there are not easy to incorporate into a plan. Again, I think the problem, there is also a lot of work in anthropology on the idea of planning itself, like this notion that whether it's urban planning or any other planning, like economic plan, this notion that you can create a blueprint for the future and then use that to kind of manage how things unfold is a very, again, this modernist idea, right? That somehow we're in control. But from another point of view, we know that we're not really in control, right? That most you can do is try to put guardrails or put, certain kinds of frameworks in place that prevent certain kinds of adverse outcomes and move things in a more positive direction. But urban, I mean, there's such complicated systems. Even if you just take one piece of it, like transport, it's not easy to plan and manage because it's such a complex entity. And then the other thing that's missing very often is the question of the people. Human societies are also dynamic. People are not just sitting in one place, right? And as soon as something changes, their livelihoods change, they may move, they may migrate. So it's hard to plan around all these things. It's that simple.
Yes, and the dynamic between, regional plans and city master plans is also very strongly related to vote bank politics and, redistribution of populations. So it's a wider question there, which we will see unfold in times to come, I suppose. There are questions from Koteshwara Rao Konduru, who's a PhD scholar in political science at the University of Hyderabad. Koteshwara Rao says he's working on the thesis tentatively titled The Politics of Land Pooling Scheme in Amaravati, Andhra Pradesh. As part of their theoretical framework, the Marxist idea of subsumption can be attributed to land in our case, or is it too soon to think of those lines? That's one part of the question. The other is, can we think of structural injustice in the conceptual understanding of Dalit land pooling here? Because it encapsulates the complicated combination of two complex structure entities, that is caste and state-induced political economy developmental structures. And thank you for your work, as it is a big relief for my research to look onto.
Thank you. I don't think I want to deal with this idea of subsumption. I'm not sure how we would use that in this case. I'll think about it. But the second one is, yes, a big part of my argument in the book, which I didn't go into today, is looking at the ways in which the agrarian structure of this region, which is based in landholding as well as caste, as it is in all of India, basically also structures the way in which the project unfolds. And it's not just a matter of like winners and losers, who had land, who didn't have land. But what I look at is the struggle around assigned lands, which are primarily dotted lands, because those lands, as you know, are lands that were, assigned or granted to landless families once upon a time to cultivate, but technically they still belong to the government. They can be resumed at any time, and that's the way the government always regards them. But in this case, Dalits in this region being quite aware and active immediately raised the question is, why is there a land pooling package for the Pata lands and not for our lands? And they were very successful actually in mounting that struggle. And they got, after a lot of, fight, they got the government to agree that assigned lands would also be given a package under the land pooling scheme. But it was a lesser package than what the Pata land was getting. And so I trace that, and I draw on historical work to kind of make this argument about how caste gets reproduced and re-entrenched through the landholding system, and that landholding system in turn gets kind of reinvigorated through the land pooling process. So that in a sense, you have reproduction of caste within the planned city, even though that's not obviously the intention of this kind of a land pooling scheme. So I don't know whether that exactly answered your question, but that's the way I'm thinking about this linkage between caste and land and urbanization in this context.
Koteshwara Rao has a follow-up question. How do we understand the idea of consent of people already given in the land pooling process? Can we think on those lines of manufactured consent by the very innate design of the land pooling scheme?
Yeah, I mean, consent is a difficult proposition, right? It's philosophically and sociologically problematic, but here I haven't gone into all that because I'm just looking at the technicalities. Once they sign the consent form, what is the status of their land and what is it that, they get in return for that? And I look a bit closely at the whole administrative system because it's very interesting also how the land gets transformed once the consent form is given and the government has given you an agreement. Your land basically exits the land revenue system. It's no longer part of the land records of the revenue department. And it enters a kind of legal limbo, which I look at also in the book, until it actually gets, liquefied and then I don't know what the word is, crystallized in another form of land. And to me, that's a very interesting process in itself, and where consent is really just the first step.
More questions on social relationships. Minati Dash says, thanks, Carol, for the fantastic book talk. I wanted to learn about the major, what's in which this mega project and the processes unleashed by it has reconfigured social relations in the communities, particularly agrarian relations and gender.
Okay. I mean, it has reconfigured in many ways. And one of the big things that happened, of course, is that farmers who were cultivating land on tenancy had no rights in the land. It belongs to the landlord. So that the tenancy relations are also undergirded it's not just a contract that, I cultivate your land and I'll give you this much of the crop. It's also a long-standing social relation that binds landlords and tenants with a lot of other types of obligations. So those all got broken down. And those tenants may be lower, relatively lower caste, or they may be even of the same community. But the kind of, expectations that tenants had in terms of support from the landowner, they spoke about how, all that got lost because they've just, the land is gone and now they don't care about us. And I heard similar narratives from agricultural workers who often work on the same farms, year after year, and how basically, the farmers that they depended upon for that employment washed their hands once all this started. Like, they don't recognize them at all, and they have to go far away outside the Rajdhani area to look for work, etc. So there's a lot of churning within the villages around, because of this kind of a change, as you would expect. There was also a lot of people talking about how obnoxious the young people had become. The young people from families that sold land and that were in the land pooling system, because suddenly they had money, and now all these young kids are buying, loud motorcycles and fancy phones and showing off around the village. So that kind of, conspicuous consumption that we often see in these contexts was also very evident there. Again, leading to conflicts, generational conflicts and so on. But the gender thing was very interesting. The only thing I really talk about gender in the book is the Save Amaravati movement. And that was because, it's not a good reason, but because women were so much at the forefront. Most of the people I interviewed on that were women. And then I got a sense about, how they were thinking about this whole process and how that might have been altering, relations within the family as well. But I don't write a whole lot about that. One thing about this region, and again, it's not a good excuse, but when you're going to people's houses for interviews, it's really sometimes difficult to talk to women. They tend to stay in the background, even though they're very powerful within the household. And it's the men who will come out and talk to you. So, your perspective tends to get a bit biased that way.
We have a few more questions, Carol. Thank you for patiently responding and such rich responses from you. There's N. Annavaram says, thank you for the book and for your discussion. How proactive was the judiciary in dealing with the questions brought before it? Did people really trust in the legal settlement of their uncertainties, or were they simply waiting for the political regime to change?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting and important question. I write about this in the last chapter because I was also really amazed at the degree of faith in the law and judiciary that the land pooling farmers had. Once they got over the shock and they started, organizing and mobilizing and thinking, how do we fight against this? They certainly weren't waiting for the government to change, because that was also uncertain, right? There were lawyers, like Supreme Court lawyers from Delhi, who were giving their time free of charge because it was such a big issue. They did fundraising and hired more lawyers. They filed multiple petitions in the High Court. They followed the cases meticulously. All of the farmers I knew had these big, files full of copies of all these legal filings, and they had learned a lot about the law. And whenever the case was being heard, one of the cases, they were there in the court, in full regalia as, peasant farmers. So, and I think a question that still stays with me is, why do they have this huge faith? I write about the faith they had in the law and judiciary, which actually was borne out because they won the major cases. But I'm never really sure where that comes from. Because I know a lot of social movements also depend on law, but they don't always get the judgments that they want, right? So often social movements avoid that and stick to more kind of direct political demonstrations. But in this case, there's a great faith in the state, and that the state would ultimately see the errors of its way despite whoever is in power. And in fact, I don't know whether I put that photo in the book, and they had protest camps set up in all the villages where people would do dana every day. And then they had like shrines there with like some of the, local deities, etc. There was a new statue that you would see in these shrines for the goddess of justice, which is actually a made-up deity. It's not a traditional deity, but they started worshiping the goddess of justice during their demonstrations as well.
The cultural turn in social movements and legalities.
Well, I mean, in fact, religion was invoked quite a bit in the movement, and I didn't talk about that too much either. That has its, one can argue about that in different directions. But they used a lot of religious idioms and iconography. I think partly it's a way of mobilizing people, and partly it's like they're also carving out the sacred landscape of the state. The first Padayatra went from Amaravati to Tirupati, right? Carrying the chariot of Lord Venkateshwara. So you cannot disconnect religion from these sentiments around land, region, identity, etc. And they invoke those symbols, very kind of cleverly also.
Couple more questions. Butch Gadde says again, very good question. Several cases are on hold at the judiciary, no judgments to date. But as you know, in India, how judiciary is functioning, I would leave it to one's imagination. It's more of a comment. There's an anonymous attendee who says, thank you for a fantastic talk. How do you see land pooling in Amaravati in comparison to other similar exercises in India? The governments of Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, and Haryana are also conducting similar exercises where the politics are very different. Is there something about Amaravati that's particular to Andhra and CBN?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I've been trying to argue, because it's true that they've used, so for example, Mike Levian's book, which is about Mahendra World City project, which is, outside of Jaipur, that whole book is about the, resistance to land acquisition. But in that case, also they used a land pooling scheme. But that land pooling scheme did not capture any of the farmers' imaginations. They mounted a resistance just like in so many other cases. So I think there is something very particular about this region, about the kind of farmers who were there. And this is a region where people are, very well networked, they're very politically aware, and they're very educated. And the other thing about these villages I forgot to mention is that you will not find young people there. These are villages where farming families already have one foot outside agriculture. The young people are educated. They're in Bangalore, Hyderabad, or they're in the US. The NRI factor is very important here. So I think because the project came into an area that's already in this process of transition, it just presents itself as an opportunity rather than as something that's going to just, you automatically oppose because it's destroying your livelihood. All my interlocutors were older men. They've been farming their whole life. They love farming. They don't want to give it up, but they know that the next generation is not going to be there. So, that's a big incentive for them also to, support this kind of a scheme.
There's a last question coming back to the, problem of consent. Himalaya Tehseen, thank you, Carol and CPR. Was there any role of Panchayat Raj Act and Gram Sabha's consent?
Yeah, so short answer, no. As I said, they basically, the functioning of the panchayats was superseded once the CRDA Act was passed. Interestingly, though, whenever a major decision had to be taken, they did hold gram sabhas in the villages, and they did want to get the signatures, of whatever percentage was required. So I'm not exactly sure why they would do that, because very often the gram sabha would be called by, especially the opposing villages, they would call a gram sabha actually to oppose something that the government was trying to do. So for example, in the protesting villages, they didn't want to be incorporated into a new planning region. And so they said that we want to be, stay with the Tenali Mangalagiri region. So there were these jurisdictional kind of conflicts going on. But I have not documented it very carefully, like how many gram sabhas were held and for what purpose, etc. I did attend a few of those meetings. So they were often on very specific issues where the government wanted to do something and, they needed the voice assent. And they did follow that process. But the panchayats, not only were the panchayats not functioning, the CRDA appointed what were called CRDA village committees, which were basically Kama land pooling farmers who were made to kind of take decisions for the village. And their main function was really to convince the other farmers to pool the land. And once land pooling was over, those committees also were disbanded.
And moving forward for the implementation of the city itself, what is the role of these, panchayats, the former panchayats, which have suspended their
Right. There would
their
be no
operations?
role. I mean, they would form an urban local body, presumably, and have elections, etc. But I don't know if there's any roadmap for that yet. Because right now, the only population living in the planned area are in the villages. So I'm not sure at what stage they're planning to do all that.
Things to explore. We have Partho Mukhopadhyay, who has raised his hand. Partho, over to you for sharing your thoughts, please.
Sure. Hi, Carol.
Hi.
I was just wondering about, going back to your work on farmer capitalists in the coastal Andhra, and I was just wondering whether this, very, as you said, the strategy of farmers waiting, assembling, valorizing, this whole financial land story that you spoke about. And the area where a lot of the Guntur area, which was taken over, my understanding was some of it at least was tobacco farming, which is sort of cash crop kind of story. So do you see that history and that socialization sort of enabling this kind of transformation, or rather making this kind of transformation easier? I mean, how do you relate the fact that a lot of the, this whole, your findings at that time, that a lot of the capitalism was driven in sort of emerged out of the agricultural communities with this experience now in Amaravati? I'm just sort of asking you to sort of reflect on how you see your previous work connect to what you're finding now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of answered this question before, but definitely I do try to connect it, because I think you have to look at the social and economic history of the region and how this particular, caste, class, whatever you want to call it, community, its experience in terms of, I mean, for one thing, I think in all of Guntur, Krishna, and beyond, there's nothing like subsistence agriculture. It's all commercial. It has been for a very long time, right, from colonial times, right? And so farmers have always been involved with the market. And the other thing about this, this argument about diversification is that, except maybe in very remote villages, everybody has got their relatives in kin in the towns, in the cities. It's this community as a community is networked across city and country, across agriculture, industry, business, across the world. And so I think those connections, even though many of the farmers I met actually were from quite remote villages, they're not well off, they're not necessarily well educated, but because of the caste network, they have a certain kind of social capital, which allows them, first of all, to have some political sway, or some, they know who to call if they have a problem, right? Somebody in the administration, somebody in the party. And it kind of acts as a political force of its own, apart from the party. And I haven't tried to track exactly how that works, because obviously it's really hard to uncover a lot of these connections. But my argument about, and the thing is, it's very difficult to talk about caste in this way, because people tend to react negatively to you. But I'm talking about a community that spans across all these different class and occupational categories, where they themselves are very proud of what they've accomplished. Kamas themselves talk about being very successful, being very entrepreneurial, etc. So I'm only picking up on that. I'm not like looking from outside and saying. And so because there's this history of social mobilization around caste identity, which is linked to business investment, which is linked to capital accumulation, which is linked to land. I think all of that comes into play here. And that's kind of my argument about how we have to understand the Amaravati project. Someone earlier asked me, and I think it's true, I don't think this could even have been conceived of in most other regions of India. There's something very peculiar and particular about this place and this history that allows this imagination to take root, is kind of what my argument is. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. No, yeah, I mean, I've yet to read your book, so I'm hoping that you elaborate on this at some length there, because this is, it's fascinating, this sort of path dependence of this process, because a lot of as you can see, a lot of the questions are about how transferable it is, how can you do it here, and how sort of place specific is this. And so from what you were saying right now, there is definitely a lot of specificity to this particular location and this population, and which make it difficult to sort of think about using this model in a more generalizable fashion. Is that a fair sort of conclusion to draw from what you just said?
Yeah, definitely. And I would also add to that, I think, sometimes we do have to get into particularities rather than just, think about general models and processes. I think there's something very particular about the figure of Chandrababu Naidu. I mean, the fact that he is the party leader, the fact that he is, he has an imagination and a kind of ambition and drive that you cannot think of in many other politicians. If you just look back at his time, earlier time as CM in Hyderabad, he did things which, and you can criticize or not, but this is the way many people talk about. He did things that no one else in Karnataka they tried to replicate, but here they were. IT and all kind of came up organically. He engineered the whole thing. And he's got this, everyone talks about him as a man of vision. And I always kind of take it with a grain of salt, like they love him. So, but in a sense he is, right? And when you have a leader like that, things happen which maybe don't happen so easily without that person. But that's for the political theorists. I really don't, I don't want to take that argument too far also.
Thank you,
Thank
Carol.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you indeed for this very excellent presentation initially, and then such a rich discussion. It's an amazing book. I've started to read, and I've read quite a bit already. Fascinating. And thanks very much to all our participants who've engaged with the book and with Carol. Such, insightful questions. We'd like to also, I'd like to request my colleague from CSH, Rama Devi, who's here to join us in thanking you for this, for joining us in the CPR CSH Urban Workshop Series.
Thank you so much. It was a great discussion. Thanks to everyone who came and asked questions. And
Rama is not very clearly visible.
And as a reminder, the link is there in the email. This is a downloadable ebook, open access. So please do read if you are inclined.
Most certainly. Thank you very much once again.
Rama is a shadowy figure. You must sort of, she's sort of, I think, somewhere in some netherland at this point in time.
I don't know. I tried to change my background. And now it is so blurry. I'm so sorry.
Yes, so Rama, you have essentially only background and no foreground now.
I can see that. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Yeah. I just want to thank you, Professor Carol, for your fascinating presentation and to responding to all our questions so patiently for such a long time. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
With this, we'll bring this session to a close.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks.